Whoopi mocked John Kennedy's dog tag on live TV. His response left the entire studio in silence. The email arrived in John Kennedy's inbox with the kind of understated subject line that could have been mistaken for routine correspondence. The View invites Senator John Kennedy for a conversation on leadership and values. It sat there unassuming among a sea of unread messages, requests for meetings, constituent concerns, and the usual flurry of Capitol Hill noise. But this one was different. It carried a weight that wasn't in the words themselves, but in what they implied. Kennedy, a senator from Louisiana, known for his sharp wit and folksy charm, leaned back in his creaky leather chair, the faint hum of his office's air conditioner filling the silence. The late afternoon light slanted through the window of his modest D.C. office, catching the edge of a small weathered frame on his desk, a photograph of him and a friend from years past, both in military fatigues, grinning under a sun that didn't know their future. Kennedy's fingers brushed against the dog tag tucked beneath his collar, a habit he barely noticed anymore. It was always there, a quiet piece of metal that carried more than its weight in memory. He opened the email, his eyes scanning the polite, polished invitation. It was cordial, professional, the kind of thing you'd expect from a daytime talk show aiming to fill a segment with a notable figure. But Kennedy wasn't naive. He'd been in politics long enough to know that invitations like this often came with a script, one he wasn't sure he wanted to follow. His chief of staff, Clara, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, a tablet balanced against her hip. She'd read the email before he did, her instincts honed from years of navigating the political battlefield. "They're not inviting you to chat, John," she said, her voice low but sharp, like she was warning him about a storm on the horizon. "They're setting a stage. You walk in there, and they'll want a soundbite, a slip-up, something to clip and share before you're even out of the studio." Kennedy didn't look up right away. He was still staring at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Clara stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. "You're not a talk show guy," she continued. "You're a senator. You deal in policy, not performance. They'll poke at you, try to get a rise. That's what they do." She wasn't wrong. The View had a reputation, a platform where sharp-tongued hosts could turn a casual comment into a viral moment, where guests were often less interviewees and more gladiators in a brightly lit arena. Kennedy's thumb grazed the dog tag again, its edges worn smooth from years of quiet touch. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice steady, but carrying that Louisiana drawl that made every word sound like it was born on a porch swing. "But if they want a show, I'll give 'em something they didn't count on." Clara raised an eyebrow, her skepticism as clear as the sunlight cutting through the room. She'd seen Kennedy handle tough crowds, town halls, Senate hearings, even the occasional heckler at a crawfish boil back home. But this was different. This was a stage built for entertainment, not truth, and she wasn't sure he understood the stakes. "You're not walking into a debate, John," she said, softening her tone, but not her point. "They'll have note cards, an audience primed to clap on cue, and a million viewers waiting for you to say something they can twist. You're not their peer. You're their content." Kennedy leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, the frame of the photograph catching his eye again. The man standing next to him in that faded picture was long gone, a friend who'd worn a dog tag just like the one Kennedy carried now. They'd served together, laughed together, dreamed of a future that only one of them would live to see. The memory wasn't sharp anymore, not like a fresh wound, but it was there, steady and unyielding, like the weight of the metal against his chest. "Clara," he said, his voice quieter now, "I'm not going to play their game. But I'm not dodging it either. He stood moving to the window where the city hummed below a restless pulse of traffic and ambition. The office wasn't flashy, no mahogany panels or gold-plated pens. Just a few bookshelves, a worn rug, and a small canvas duffel bag tucked in the corner, the kind you'd expect to find in a soldier's bunk, not a senator's office. Kennedy's eyes lingered on it for a moment before he crossed the room and knelt beside it. The zipper was stiff, the canvas faded, but it opened with a familiar rasp. Inside was a small wooden box, unpolished, unremarkable. He lifted it out his fingers, moving with a care that suggested it held more than it seemed. Clara watched her arms uncrossing her tablet, forgotten. "What's that?" she asked, though she already sensed it wasn't just a keepsake. Kennedy opened the box, revealing a single brass pin, its surface scratched and dulled by time. It wasn't military, not officially, but it carried the same weight as the dog tag, a gift from that same friend given during a quiet moment before a deployment that would change everything. This, Kennedy said, holding the pin up to the light, was his. He said it was for luck. Guess it worked for one of us. Clara didn't respond right away. She'd worked with Kennedy for years, seen him navigate the Senate with a mix of charm and steel, but this was a side she rarely glimpsed. The dog tag, the pin, the way his voice dropped when he spoke of his friend, they weren't props or political tools. They were anchors, pieces of a past that kept him grounded in a world that often felt like quicksand. "You're not bringing that to the show, are you?" she asked. Her tone caught between concern and curiosity. Kennedy didn't answer directly. He closed the box and set it on the desk next to the photograph. "If I go," he said, "I'm not going as a politician. I'm going as me. And this," he tapped the box, "is me." Clara sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You're gonna make my job harder, aren't you?" Kennedy's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Always," he said. The decision to accept the invitation wasn't made lightly. By evening, the office was buzzing with hushed conversations. Aides whispered about the risks, about the online chatter already starting to swirl. Why's Kennedy going on The View? Is he trying to rebrand? Is he dodging something? Social media was a minefield of speculation, some calling it a bold move, others a desperate one. Kennedy didn't read any of it. He'd learned long ago that the noise of the internet was just that noise. Instead, he sat alone in his office after hours, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The duffel bag was still there, the box still on his desk. He didn't open it again. Didn't need to. The weight of the pin and the dog tag was already with him, not just in his hands, but in the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he refused to let the world's expectations define him. He wasn't preparing a speech or memorizing talking points. He wasn't practicing zingers or planning deflections. He was simply deciding to show up not as the senator from Louisiana, not as a Republican, not as a public figure, but as a man who'd lost someone and kept going. The next morning, the black car arrived to take him to the studio. Clara rode with him, her tablet now a shield she clutched a little too tightly. "You sure about this?" she asked one last time as the city blurred past the windows. Kennedy didn't look at her. His eyes were on the horizon where the skyline met the sky, a place that felt both distant and familiar. The duffel bag sat at his feet, the box inside it untouched but present. "I'm not sure about much," he said, his voice low, that drawl wrapping around each word like a memory. "But I'm sure I'm not walking in there to lose myself." Clara nodded, though her jaw tightened. She knew better than to argue when he got like this, quiet, resolute, like a man who'd already fought battles most people couldn't imagine. The car pulled up to the studio, the glass doors gleaming under the morning sun, the hum of production already spilling out. Kennedy stepped out the dog tag, hidden beneath his collar, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't look like a man heading into a talk show. He looked like a man walking into a moment he'd been preparing for his whole life, even if he didn't know it yet. Inside the studio was a hive of activity producers barking orders, makeup artists darting between rooms, interns clutching clipboards like lifelines. Kennedy moved through it all with a calm that felt out of place, like a stone in a river. The green room was small, functional, with a mirror, a couch, and a tray of bottled water that nobody touched. Clara hovered nearby her phone, buzzing with updates from the team back in D.C. "They're already tweeting about you," she said, scrolling through her screen. "Half of them think you're gonna crash and burn. The other half think you're trying to play hero." Kennedy sat on the couch, the duffel bag beside him. He didn't respond, just let his fingers rest on the bag's strap, his thumb brushing the coarse fabric. The dog tag shifted slightly against his chest, a reminder of why he was here. Not to win, not to perform, but to carry something real into a space that thrived on artifice. A production assistant poked her head in her headset, crackling. 5 minutes. "Senator," she said, her voice clipped but polite. Kennedy nodded, his expression unreadable. Clara set her phone down, her eyes meeting his. "Whatever happens out there," she said, "don't let them make you into something you're not." Kennedy's gaze softened just for a moment. "I've been carrying heavier things than their expectations," he said. And with that, he stood duffel bag in hand, ready to walk into the light. The hallway to the stage was narrow, lined with posters of past guests, actors, musicians, politicians, all smiling for the cameras. Kennedy didn't look at them. His steps were steady, deliberate, the kind of walk you learn when you've carried weight for years, not just on your shoulders, but in your soul. The dog tag was still there, hidden but present, a quiet pulse against his heart. The brass pin was in the box, tucked inside the duffel bag, a piece of a past he wasn't ready to share yet, but couldn't leave behind. The stage lights were visible now, bright and unforgiving, the kind that could expose every flaw or make you look larger than life, depending on how you stood. Kennedy didn't plan to stand any particular way. He wasn't here to pose or perform. He was here to speak, to carry a truth that didn't need a spotlight to shine. The production assistant signaled for him to wait. Her hand raised as the theme music started to play, the audience's applause rising like a wave. Kennedy took a breath, his hand resting on the duffel bag one last time. He wasn't nervous, not exactly, but he felt the weight of the moment, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. And then the music faded, the lights shifted, and the assistant whispered, "You're on!" Kennedy stepped forward, not as a senator, not as a guest, but as a man who knew what it meant to carry loss and still keep walking. The stage lights of the View burned bright, casting a polished sheen over the set. A curved table, cushioned chairs, and a backdrop of vibrant colors meant to keep the energy high. The audience, primed by warm-up banter, clapped on cue as the theme music faded their applause, a practiced rhythm that felt more like habit than enthusiasm. John Kennedy stepped onto the stage, his weathered blazer and unassuming posture at odds with the glossy environment. The dog tag rested beneath his collar, a quiet weight against his chest, and the duffel bag hung from his shoulder, its canvas worn but sturdy. He took his seat, the chair creaking faintly under him, and set the bag at his feet, its presence unnoticed by the cameras, but grounding him in a way the spotlight never could. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg leaned back, her smile sharp and ready, her note cards fanned out like a poker hand she knew how to play. The KEO hosts Joy, Sunny, and Sarah sat poised, their expressions a mix of curiosity and calculated warmth. The red light on the camera blinked, signaling the world was watching. Kennedy's eyes didn't dart to the lenses. He wasn't here to perform. Whoopi wasted no time. "So, Senator Kennedy," she began, her voice a blend of honey and edge, "you've got that dog tag peeking out from your collar. What's the deal? You running for Rambo's old job?" The audience chuckled the sound light, but orchestrated a ripple that waited for permission to grow. It was the kind of jab meant to set the tone playful, but with a hook designed to nudge the guest into a defensive quip or a rehearsed laugh. Kennedy didn't flinch. His hands rested on his thighs, steady as stone, the faint glint of the dog tag catching the light as he shifted slightly. He looked at Whoopi, not with defiance, but with a calm that seemed to pull the air from the room. "This," he said, his Louisiana drawl slow and deliberate, "ain't about a movie role." He reached up, pulling the dog tag free from his collar, letting it dangle in the light. The metal was scratched, worn, not a prop, but a relic. This belonged to a friend who didn't make it home. He wore it when he said his last prayers in a place most folks don't think about. The words landed like a slow, heavy stone, dropped into still water. The audience's laughter stopped, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. Whoopi's smile froze her eyes, narrowing just enough to betray her surprise. The co-hosts shifted in their seats, their practiced ease cracking at the edges. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was thick, electric, the kind that made you aware of every sound, the hum of the studio lights, the faint rustle of an audience member adjusting their position, the soft click of a camera operator's shoe against the floor. Kennedy didn't rush to fill it. He let the moment breathe, his fingers still holding the dog tag its weight, more than physical. "I don't wear this for attention," he continued, his voice low but unwavering. "I wear it because some things don't get left behind, even when the world moves on." The room didn't just quiet, it stilled. Joy's pen paused mid-scribble on her note card. Sunny's smile faltered, her hands folding tightly in her lap. Sarah glanced at Whoopi as if waiting for a cue, but Whoopi was still processing her grin, replaced by a look that hovered between unease and respect. The audience, trained to clap or laugh, didn't know what to do. A woman in the front row clutched her purse a little tighter. A man in the third row lowered his phone, his thumb no longer scrolling. Whoopi recovered first, leaning forward with a chuckle that sounded forced, like she was trying to pull the room back to her rhythm. "Well, that got serious fast," she said, her tone light, but strained like a balloon stretched too thin. "But come on, Senator, you're a politician. You know how this works. Dog tags, big stories. It's all part of the image, right?" The jab was sharper this time, a challenge wrapped in a smile daring him to play the game or take the bait. The audience stirred a few hesitant laughs, breaking the tension, but they were thin, uncertain. Kennedy didn't rise to it. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his eyes meeting Whoopi's with a steadiness that made her blink. "If this was about image," he said, "I'd have left it at home." He reached down to the duffel bag at his feet. His movements deliberate, unhurried. The cameras zoomed in, sensing something was coming, though no one knew what. He unzipped the bag and pulled out a small wooden box, its surface scuffed and unpolished, the kind of thing you'd find in a garage, not a senator's office. He opened it, revealing a single brass pin, its edges dulled by time, but still carrying a faint gleam. This, Kennedy said, holding the pin up for the room to see, was his too. His voice didn't waver, but it carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. He gave it to me before he shipped out. Said it was for luck. I kept it not because I believe in luck, but because I believe in him. The audience was silent again, but this time it wasn't just shock. It was something deeper, a collective holding of breath, as if they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see on daytime TV. Kennedy set the box on the table between them, the pin resting inside like a quiet monument. "You can call it a prop if you want," he said, his eyes still on Whoopi. "But to me, it's a promise. A promise to remember what he gave up, what a lot of folks gave up so we could sit here and talk." The words weren't loud, but they carried, filling the room with a truth that didn't need volume to be heard. Whoopi's note card slipped slightly in her hand, her fingers tightening around them as if they could anchor her. The co-hosts were silent, their usual banter replaced by a stillness that felt foreign on this set. A man in the second row stood, his movement sudden but not disruptive. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a faded denim jacket and hands that looked like they'd worked hard all their life. The cameras swung toward him, the producers backstage exchanging frantic glances, but the director held up a hand. "Let it play." "I knew someone like that," the man said, his voice rough but clear. "My cousin. He didn't come back either, wore a tag, just like that." He pointed at Kennedy, not with accusation, but with recognition. "You don't talk about it to make people feel sorry for you. You talk about it so we don't forget." The room inhaled not a gasp, but a shared moment, like a pulse running through the crowd. Kennedy nodded just once, his eyes meeting the man's with a quiet respect. "That's right," he said softly. "It's not about pity. It's about truth." The man sat down, his chair creaking, and the audience seemed to lean forward, not physically but emotionally, as if they were no longer just spectators, but part of something real. Whoopi cleared her throat, her voice softer now, less certain. "Okay, Senator," she said, trying to regain control. "You're making it hard to keep this light." The audience gave a small laugh, but it was different now, less prompted, more human, like they were laughing with her vulnerability rather than at her joke. Kennedy didn't smile. He didn't need to. He leaned forward slightly, the dog tag catching the light again. "Light's fine," he said, "but truth don't always come with a laugh track." The words landed not as a rebuke, but as a reminder, and the room felt smaller, more intimate, as if the walls of the studio had closed in to hold the moment. The cameras kept rolling, the lights kept burning, but something had shifted. Kennedy wasn't here to spar or charm. He was here to carry a weight, and the audience for the first time felt it too. The studio lights of The View seemed to dim, not in brightness, but in their ability to distract, as the air grew heavy with the weight of John Kennedy's words. The audience, once primed for laughter and quick applause, sat in a stillness that felt almost sacred, their eyes fixed on the senator from Louisiana. The dog tag hung from his neck, its faint gleam a quiet testament to the friend he'd lost, while the brass pin rested in its open wooden box on the table. A relic of a promise kept. Whoopi Goldberg. Her note cards now a forgotten prop in her lap, leaned back in her chair, her usual sharpness softened by the unexpected gravity of the moment. The CO hosts Joy, Sunny, and Sarah sat quietly, their rehearsed smiles replaced by expressions of unease and awe. The cameras, still rolling, caught every angle, but the operators seemed to move with a reverence, as if aware they were capturing something rare. Kennedy sat steady, his hands resting on his thighs, his posture not rigid, but grounded, like a man who'd learned to carry loss without letting it define him. The silence wasn't empty. It was alive, pulsing with the unspoken stories of everyone in the room. Then, without warning, the massive screen behind the set flickered. It was meant for cheerful graphics ads, for sponsors, clips from viral moments. But instead, a stark white message appeared on a black background, the words unpolished and raw. I'm a veteran. I lost my brother in Iraq. I was going to give up tonight, but hearing you talk about carrying pain without shame, it's making me think I can hold on one more day. The room gasped a single collective breath that seemed to pull the air from the studio. The message wasn't planned, wasn't scripted. A producer backstage had accidentally triggered a submission meant for a different segment, but it was too late to stop it. The words hung there, burning into the silence, a confession from someone unseen. Somewhere out there, watching through a screen. Kennedy turned slowly to face the message, his eyes tracing each word, his face unreadable but heavy with purpose. The dog tag shifted slightly against his chest, and for a moment, it was as if he could see through the screen to the person who'd written those words, a stranger whose pain echoed his own. Whoopi's hands tightened around her water glass, her knuckles pale. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, her usual wit abandoned in the face of something too real to deflect. Joy leaned forward, her pen, forgotten, her eyes glistening with something she hadn't expected to feel on this set. Sunny's hands were clasped so tightly, her fingers trembled, and Sarah, usually quick with a question, just stared at the screen, her breath shallow. The audience was frozen, some leaning forward, others clutching their neighbors' hands as if the words had reached into their own lives and pulled something loose. Kennedy didn't rush to speak. He let the message linger, let it breathe, let it settle into the room like a truth too heavy to move. Then slowly, he stood not for drama, but because sitting felt wrong in a moment like this. His voice when it came was low, steady, that Louisiana drawl wrapping around each word like a hand extended across a divide. "Whoever you are," he said, looking into the camera as if it could carry his words directly to the veteran. "I don't know your name, and I don't know your story, but I know what it's like to feel like the pain's bigger than you are." He paused, his hand brushing the dog tag, a gesture so subtle it was almost unconscious. "You're still here, and that's not nothing. Don't let go just yet." The studio was silent, but it wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of recognition, of shared humanity. A woman in the fourth row wiped her eyes, her mascara smudging as she nodded not at Kennedy, but at something inside herself. A young man in a hoodie seated near the back stopped, fidgeting, his hands still for the first time since the show began. The camera operators trained to chase the action held their shots, unwilling to break the moment. Backstage, a producer whispered to the director, "Should we cut?" The director shook his head, his own eyes fixed on Kennedy. "No," he said. "This is what we're here for." Kennedy sat back down, but the energy in the room had shifted permanently. The stage, once a place for banter and sound bites, felt like something else now, a space where truth had slipped through the cracks of performance. Whoopi cleared her throat, her voice softer than it had been all day. "Senator," she said, her usual edge replaced by something raw, "you're not playing by the rules here." It wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement, almost an apology. Kennedy's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Never been much for rules when it comes to what's real," he said. The audience murmured, not in agreement, but in understanding, a sound that felt like a collective exhale. Then, from the far corner of the studio, a woman stood. She was in her 40s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her hands trembling as she gripped the armrest of her chair. The cameras swung toward her, the crew caught off guard again, but no one stopped her. "My son," she said, her voice breaking but clear. "He came back from Afghanistan, But he's not the same. He doesn't talk about it, doesn't want to. But hearing you—" She paused, swallowing hard, her eyes locked on Kennedy. "It's like you're giving him permission to feel what he's feeling. And maybe me, too." Her voice cracked, and she sat down quickly as if the weight of her own words had pushed her back into her seat. Kennedy nodded, his eyes meeting hers across the room. "That's all I'm trying to do," he said quietly. "Not to fix it, not to make it go away, but to say it's okay to carry it." The woman nodded back, her hands pressed to her chest, and the audience around her seemed to lean closer, not to her, but to the moment, to the connection that had formed without anyone planning it. Whoopi, for the first time, didn't try to steer the conversation back to her script. She set her note cards down, her fingers lingering on them as if they were a lifeline she no longer needed. "You know," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "we don't get moments like this often. I thought I knew what to expect from you, Senator, but I was wrong. It wasn't just an admission. It was a bridge, a small step toward understanding." The Kyo hosts nodded almost in unison, their silence a sign of respect for a space they hadn't anticipated occupying. Kennedy leaned forward, his hands resting on the table, the brass pin still visible in its box. "I didn't come here to change your mind," he said, his eyes sweeping the room, taking in the audience, the hosts, the cameras. "I came because sometimes you gotta say what's true, even when it's heavy. Especially when it's heavy." The audience was no longer a collection of strangers waiting for entertainment. They were witnesses, each carrying their own stories, their own losses, their own reasons to listen. A man in the back row, his arms crossed tightly, just minutes ago now, had his hands open, resting on his knees as if he'd let go of something he hadn't realized he was holding. A young woman near the front, her phone forgotten in her lap, whispered to her friend, "This feels real." And it was. The studio, with its bright lights and polished set, had become something else. A place where pain wasn't a performance, where truth wasn't a soundbite, and where a man with a dog tag and a brass pin had reminded everyone what it meant to be human. The studio of The View was no longer just a set. The bright lights, the polished table, the vibrant backdrop all seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by a presence that couldn't be choreographed. John Kennedy sat at the center of it all. His weathered blazer, a stark contrast to the glossy stage, the dog tag resting against his chest, and the brass pin in its open wooden box on the table before him. The duffel bag at his feet was a quiet anchor, its canvas worn from years of carrying more than just objects. The audience, once a lively crowd primed for applause, now sat in a reverent hush, their eyes fixed on the senator from Louisiana, not as a politician, but as a man who had brought something raw and unshakable into their midst. Whoopi Goldberg, her note cards limp in her lap, looked at Kennedy with a mix of awe and vulnerability, her usual command of the stage softened by the weight of the moment. The Kyo hosts, Joy, Sunny, and Sarah, were silent, their faces reflecting a shared realization that this wasn't the show they'd planned. The cameras kept rolling, but the operators moved with a care that suggested they were documenting something sacred, not just capturing content. The message from the veteran, still lingering in the air from the screen's accidental display, had shifted the room's gravity, and Kennedy's response had made it impossible to return to the scripted rhythm of daytime TV. Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, his gaze steady, but not forceful. "I didn't come here to preach," he said, his Louisiana drawl carrying a warmth that felt like it came from a porch conversation rather than a studio spotlight. "I came because sometimes you gotta give a voice to what hurts, not to make it go away, but to make it mean something." The words settled into the room not as a lecture, but as an invitation, a call to recognize the pain that so many carried in silence. The audience was still, but it was a different kind of stillness now, not shock, not discomfort, but a shared understanding, a collective pause that felt like the moment before a prayer. A woman in the third row, her hands clasped tightly, nodded slowly as if Kennedy's words had unlocked something she'd kept buried. A young man near the back, his hoodie pulled low over his eyes, leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, listening in a way that suggested he was hearing something he'd needed for a long time. Whoopi. Her voice, quieter than it had been all day, set her note cards down entirely, her hands folding in her lap as if surrendering to the moment. "Senator," she said, her tone stripped of its usual edge, "I gotta be honest. When you walked out here, I thought I had you figured out. I thought this was going to be a quick hit, a little banter, maybe a viral clip. But you—" She paused, shaking her head, a faint smile breaking through her vulnerability. "You're not letting us off that easy, are you?" The audience gave a soft chuckle. Not prompted, but genuine, a release of tension that felt human rather than performative. Kennedy's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a gesture of acknowledgement. "Life don't let any of us off easy," he said, "but it's not about dodging the hard stuff. It's about what you do with it." He reached for the brass pin, lifting it gently from its box, holding it up so the light caught its scratched surface. "This pin," he said, "wasn't given to me to make me feel strong. It was given to me to remind me that strength ain't about standing tall. It's about standing up again and again, even when you're tired." The room inhaled a subtle but collective breath, as if everyone felt the weight of his words. A man in the front row, his suit slightly rumpled, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to hide the gesture, but failing. A young woman in the fifth row, her phone forgotten on her lap, whispered to her friend, "I get it now." Kennedy set the pin back in its box, his fingers lingering on it for a moment before he looked out at the audience. "I've been carrying this dog tag and this pin for years," he said, his voice steady but thick with memory. "Not because they fix anything, but because they remind me that pain don't make you weak. It makes you human. And being human means you don't have to hide what hurts." The words weren't loud, but they carried reaching every corner of the studio, sinking into the hearts of those who listened. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the quiet intensity in Kennedy's face, the lines etched not by age, but by experience, by loss, by survival. Then, from the center of the audience, a voice broke the silence. It was a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, her hair pulled back in a messy braid, her hands trembling as she stood. The cameras turned toward her, the producers backstage exchanging glances, but making no move to stop her. "I lost my dad 2 years ago," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "He was a firefighter. He didn't come home one day, and I've been angry ever since. Angry at him, at the world, at myself for not saying more when I had the chance." She paused, her eyes locking on Kennedy's, not as a senator, but as someone who understood. "Hearing you talk about carrying that pin, that tag, it's like you're saying, it's okay to still feel him, to still be mad, to still love him." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, but she didn't sit down. Kennedy nodded, his eyes soft but steady, his posture open as if he were reaching across the distance between them. "It is okay," he said quietly. "It's okay to feel all of it. That's what keeps him with you." The woman sat down slowly, her friend reaching for her hand, and the audience around her seemed to shift closer, not physically but emotionally, as if her words had given them permission to feel their own pain. "Whoopi." Her eyes glistening, leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Senator, I owe you an apology," she said. "When I made that crack about your dog tag, I was doing my job trying to keep it light, keep it moving. But I didn't see you. I didn't see this." She gestured to the pin, to the dog tag, to the space between them that was no longer just a stage. "I forgot how to listen." It was a confession, raw and unscripted, and it landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the room. Kennedy shook his head, not dismissing her, but meeting her honesty with his own. "We all forget, sometimes," he said. "But the good thing about forgetting is you can start again." The audience was no longer a crowd of spectators. They were a community bound by a moment that had stripped away the artifice of television. A man in the back row, his arms no longer crossed, stood slowly, not to speak but to be seen, his eyes red but resolute. A woman near the front, her hands clasped tightly, rose too, her face a mix of grief and hope. One by one, others followed, not in a wave, but in a quiet, uncoordinated ripple until nearly the entire room was standing. There was no applause, no music, no cue from the producers, just people standing in silence, not for Kennedy, but for what he'd brought into the room, a permission to feel, to grieve, to carry pain without shame. The cameras captured it all, the operators moving with a reverence that matched the moment, their lenses lingering on faces, on hands, on the brass pin that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Kennedy stood too, not to claim the moment, but to share it. He looked out at the audience, his eyes scanning the faces, not seeking admiration, but connection. "I didn't come here to win anything," he said, his voice low, but carrying like a conversation meant for each person in the room. "I came because someone out there, maybe in this room, maybe watching at home, needs to know they're not alone in what they're carrying." He paused, his hand on brushing the dog tag, a gesture that felt like a prayer. "Pain don't make you less. It makes you more. It makes you someone who can look at another person's hurt and say, 'I see you.'" The words were simple, but they landed with a force that turned the studio into something else. A sanctuary, a battlefield, a place where truth didn't need a spotlight to shine. Whoopi stood now not to reclaim control, but because she couldn't stay seated. Her hands were empty, her note cards forgotten, her eyes locked on Kennedy. "You've given us something today?" she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not a show, not a moment, but a lesson. And I think we all needed it." The co-hosts nodded their silence, a testament to the shift in their perspective. Joy wiped her eyes, Sunny's hands were still clasped, and Sarah's gaze was fixed on the pin as if it held answers she hadn't known she was seeking. The audience remained standing, their silence not awkward, but holy, a collective acknowledgement of something rare and real. Kennedy looked at the pin, then at the audience, and gave a nod so subtle it felt ancient, a gesture of respect for the shared humanity in the room. The lesson. The moment wasn't about politics or performance. It was about empathy, about the courage to carry pain and the strength to share it. Kennedy's words, his dog tag, his pin, they weren't symbols of weakness, but proof that vulnerability can forge connection. The lesson was clear: empathy breaks down walls, not by erasing pain, but by honoring it, by seeing it, by refusing to let it isolate us. The audience, the hosts, the crew, they all learned that truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to show up raw and honest, to remind us that we're all fighting battles, and we're stronger when we fight them together. The studio, once a place of artifice, had become a space where people could see each other not as roles or titles, but as humans carrying their own scars, their own hopes, their own reasons to keep standing. Kennedy took a slow breath, his hand resting on the duffel bag one last time. He didn't speak again, didn't need to. The room was full of voices now, not spoken, but felt stories of loss, of resilience, of quiet victories that didn't make headlines but mattered just as much. The lights were still on, the cameras still rolling, but they were irrelevant now. The real story was in the people, in the silence, in the truth that had slipped through the cracks and changed everything. And as Kennedy stepped back ready to leave the stage, he carried the same weight he'd brought with him. Not lighter, not heavier, but shared, seen, and for the first time in a long time understood.